evening, everyone, especially to our distinguished speaker, Professor Coveney. Welcome all of you to join us on this Zoom talk on digital twins, the virtual future of medicine, co-hosted by Princeton University Press, China office, and also Yale Center Beijing. My name is Joyce Wang, the Deputy Director of the Yale Center Beijing. First, let me also quickly introduce our speaker today, Peter Coveney. He's the Adjunct Professor at the Yale School of Medicine. As well, he's the Director of the Center for Computational Science at University College London. He's also a professor at the Informatics Institute at the University of Amsterdam. Today, Professor Coveney will share his research and insights on his latest book called Virtual You, How Building Your Digital Twin Will Revolutionize Medicine and Change Your Life. We are also very grateful to co-host this talk with Princeton University Press, China office. They will kindly provide 3 copies of Professor's book, which we will give out to the first 3 audiences who pose questions during the Q&A session later. Now I would like to invite Lingxi Li, the director from the Princeton University Press, China office, and to give a very quick introduction of the entity and also Professor Coveney's book. Lingxi, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Joyce, and thanks everyone for joining this event on the Sunday evening, and thanks for Professor Coveney to offer these stimulating talks later. So I will be very brief in introducing a little bit about Princeton University Press in China and also about these books, the feature talks of today. Before then, I want to say Princeton PUP has a profound relationship with Yale in disseminating scholarly conversation, because for the past 100 years in our publishing history, PUP Princeton University Press has published more than 200 Yale-affiliated scholars across disciplines. So I very much hope to extend the gratitude to Carol, Joyce, and the YBC team for your continuous support in making every event possible. So before introducing Professor Coveney and his new book, I want to be briefly talk about PUP, what we're doing in China, because Princeton University Press published peer-reviewed books that connect authors and readers across the fields of knowledge to advance the global conversation. So we are the first and so far the only American university press opening an office in China, because PUP has a global mission and the very heart of our editorial strategy, that is to publish the leading scholars around the world and bring the best ideas to the global readers. This includes Chinese scholarships and Chinese readers. So Joyce just introduced Professor Coveney, who is the director of the Center for Computational Science at University College London, professor at the Informatics Institute, University of Amsterdam, and professor at the Yale School of Medicine. His new book, Virtual You, is a comprehensive account of efforts by scientists around the world to build virtual twins of human beings, from cells to tissues to organs and whole bodies. In this very deeply illuminating book, Professor Coveney and his co-author reveal the visionary science behind the digital human twins that will enhance our health and our future, while also addressing the emerging ethical challenges accompanying with it. We believe this informative book will provoke thought among a diverse readership, including future research leaders and pioneers who will drive this field forward. So this is a remarkable book with both intellectual depth and ability to engage a broader audience. So I think this is a privilege to have Professor Coveney with us today, and I will believe it is a very stimulating event. So I will hand over the floor to you, Professor.
Thank you so much indeed for that introduction, and it's an honor to be here. This is a genuinely multinational event. I'm sitting with a window behind me, which is actually of what's called the portico at University College London, but I'm actually in Beijing at this moment. And as you say, I am a professor adjunct at Yale School of Medicine. So there's a really interesting link there, sort of Anglo-American, Sino-Anglo-American angle on this talk. There are many things to try and convey here, and I want to keep this as understandable and comprehensible as possible. So I prepared to show a video initially. This video was prepared itself a few years ago. It's an IMAX film, so it's really at its most stunning on an IMAX screen, which we can't obviously run today. But I'll just put this on first to set the context, and then I'll take off with my talk. So initially, I'm going to share my screen and try to locate where the film is. Maybe we should be opening that film now. What do you think? Where is it? This one? That's it, I think. Yeah? Yeah. I need to share that. Let me know, can you hear me still?
Yeah.
The screen should be black because I'm about to launch a film which has music and stunning videos and animations in it. Let's see if we can get it going.
Right, yeah. Oh, very nice.
There's sound with it.
Our bodies are exquisitely complex machines.
Hello, Professor Coveney. Sorry to interrupt. Is this video have sound? We cannot hear any sound on the video.
Well, obviously, mastering drug delivery means controlling the body's main transport network, your circulatory system. By simulating the movement of red blood cells and other cells, we can understand important protective processes, like those that prevent blood loss after an injury. Virtual humans could help doctors to plan risky surgery too. They could be used to work out how to reach an aneurysm deep in the brain that is at risk of rupture, which could cause a stroke. Surgeons could then try out the best treatment or implant to suit the location and shape of that particular aneurysm. They could even double check that the implant will not cause problems, such as clotting, before they try it out on you. Physics, chemistry, and biology intertwine in your circulatory system to drive the most remarkable pump that evolution has ever created, the heart. To create a virtual heart, processes have to be modeled at multiple scales, from the contraction of muscle to the blood flowing through its chambers, to the movement of charged atoms during a contraction. Virtual hearts already beat within supercomputers, where we can test the effect of different drugs or pacemakers, but also more fundamentally, to understand the way an individual's heart works. Your virtual avatar will not only be built in your image, it will also move like you. We can use it to calculate the forces and the mechanical stresses that are constantly induced on your bones and predict the risk you will suffer a fracture. Doctors can also use virtual humans to work out how diet, exercise, or drugs can help those with brittle bones. And what if we go even further than treating disease, using virtual humans to prevent illness? Within a supercomputer, many virtual versions of you can explore small changes in your lifestyle and how they affect your health, aging, and quality of life. Virtual humans, helping you to figure out the very best that you can be.
So that was the video. It seemed like we lost the sound for a period, but did you hear the rest of it clearly?
Yes, yeah.
The
beginning, maybe first 1 minute, and there's no sound.
Right. So the purpose of that was to show they're not computer animations in the sense of, say, a Disney Hollywood movie. These are patient-specific simulations run on supercomputers in many parts of the world, in the US, particularly in Europe, and they are indications of the level of fidelity that we can perform such studies now of people on. And the main message that I'm trying to convey in the talk that I'm going to launch from here is our ability to predict things ahead of time in medicine now for the first time, because we have enough understanding of mechanisms and our ability to model using powerful computers. The computers are essential in order to get answers in a hurry. And a very good analogy, which everyone is effectively familiar with, although they may not realize it, is what happens today when people make a weather forecast. They use supercomputers, they run predictions of what tomorrow's weather the next few days is, like you were worried about a typhoon approaching, and the probability of it causing damage, flooding, and devastation is based on predictions of the same sort that I'm going to be talking about in the slides that I want to show now. So let me see if I can get hold of those and share them next. Can you tell me if you can see anything there yet?
Yeah, it's on.
I'm trying to see where it is on my own screen.
Yeah, a lot of files.
Shall I enlarge it?
Yeah.
How about
Yes.
that?
Yeah, looks perfect.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I will talk through these slides, and I will then end with another video, which is shorter than that one, which is about the next pandemic, meaning what happens after COVID, if we have one of those to deal with. How will supercomputers play a role in that, as they have done in this? So as the introduction so nicely spelled out, this talk is sort of based around a book that I published recently with my co-author, Roger Highfield. It was published in English language on the 28th of March this year. Roger Highfield is a long-standing friend and colleague of mine. He's a distinguished journalist who specializes in making accessible complicated ideas. So this is the third book I've written with him, and the work we do together is complementary insofar as I'm very keen on getting the science described. He wants to make sure it's accessible to the largest number of people, and that's what the product is in the case of this book. So let me move on to what we mean by virtual humans. And in the current era, in fact, you know, there's become a great deal of interest in what are called digital twins, and digital twins are what is a concept that dates back to engineering contexts, maybe of the order of 20 years or so ago. The idea is that you can design increasingly complicated manufacturing plants. It might be aerospace, automotive. You could be designing a rail line, as has happened recently in London. There's something called the Elizabeth line. You build the models purely on a computer in the first instance, but seek to make them as high fidelity as possible. And as you build the system in reality, which is the twin, as it were, the analog, you have a very close interaction between the two, such that they learn from each other, where the digital version needs correction from the reality as you build, you correct it. And of course, reality is being designed through the digital version. So that's what we're talking about. And the exciting thing about human digital twins or virtual humans is that we're trying to do the same thing now in the context of medicine, looking at the human body in ultimately great detail and mechanistic detail, so that we understand how it works, and we can model and simulate it and interact with it. And the real version, that is one, you know, individual humans are the twins for this type of study. And in detail, in terms of modeling, these are complicated multi-scale and multi-physics representations of the human body, because the human body is very complicated from the genome level, essentially, which is a molecular one around DNA, which we saw in the film, up to the whole human scale, but not just single humans. That's something I want to emphasize here. But potentially, and in fact, many humans, because if we're dealing with an infectious disease, COVID is the latest dreadful example of that, then of course there are interactions between humans that propagate infections that need to be dealt with. But there are also other things, namely population health, and the use of these models for in silico trials. They can be clinical trials that are going to be run purely on computers with a lot of benefits. So this is just holding out a vision for a moment of the things that are coming down the line and why it's important to know about them, and look at what medicine is today by comparison. And essentially, I'm being a little provocative here, but I can certainly justify it. We can say typically current medicine is not predictive in the sense that I'm referring to it. And as I mentioned, the weather is, because it's based on examples in the past of doctors seeing a patient who looks and like others they've seen before, and therefore should respond in a similar way. And we should be mindful that that type of approach to medicine is really a statistical inference methodology, which isn't ever going to be satisfactory, because if you try to aim for the average behavior of the population to predict how the next person is going to respond, it's very likely that there are such things as average people. They will always behave differently. And if your data sets are unrepresentative of the type of people you're trying to predict medical responses to, it will fail. So that's a problem. That's also going to be a problem with methods like artificial intelligence and AI, which are based on data sets of other people against whom your predictions are made. So that's just a little warning about how we have to handle AI in these contexts. So the development of the virtual human, and to make it truly predictive, has to be something that integrates all of this data and is firmly personalized. And to get the context motivated even better by what's happening in terms of studying complex systems today, I mentioned the weather earlier, and the weather is a challenge, but we do a reasonably good job at predicting weather into the near term using computer models and feedback with what's actually happening with sensors that are built and measure data around the world. So this picture is just showing you an example of the planet, but there are bigger challenges than just weather forecasting, which is a matter of only a few days ahead, typically. We all know that we live with a challenge called climate change, and climate change is something that has to be dealt with over decades to centuries and beyond. And the challenge there is similar to what I'm getting at with medicine. How well can we predict the future, such as the interesting long-time course or longitudinal behavior of humans in a medical sense, using modeling and simulation? How do they do it with climate modeling? And they have digital twins. Probably the most sophisticated ones that exist today are ones in which people try to capture the behavior of the world and its climate in computers by building in as much data as they can, accurate models of the processes that are involved, which are complicated, maybe not as complicated as in the human body, but certainly very complicated. And then they have strong feedback between what's happening in the physical world, which is subject to measurements and observations, and what the digital twin in the computer is doing. And the interaction between those is what we really mean by digital twins. And that's what I'm getting at in the biomedical case. And I want to stress this because areas like climate are often seen as, non-biological scenarios, and we understand in the physical world we can model things. And I'm trying to make sure we all recognize that it's now possible to model and simulate humans in a similar way, not to say it's too complicated, we cannot do it. So just briefly, the benefits in climate change are enormous because you can see the role of things in the natural world influencing the predictions, and of course the predictions feedback into what's going on in terms of the evolution into the future. And it's an interesting fact that in the most sophisticated digital twins of planet Earth, and there's one very large European project in that space that I'm thinking of, humans are actually being modeled in these systems. Is that a surprise? No, because climate change is largely being caused by human behavior, maybe over several centuries, and the response to it and the impact that it has on humans is an important aspect of how we handle it. So these models have humans in them, simple ones. So there's human modeling already going on in those things. And the benefits start to become clear as a result. I'm just going to touch on some important aspects of modeling, which people must understand in the life of medical sciences, because historically they are not used to doing modeling and simulation, let alone using it to predict outcomes before events occur. But that's exactly what we have to be able to do if we're to implement personalized medicine. The idea is we don't sort of observe a patient and discover they're in a bad way and perhaps dead and try to do something about it. We anticipate their state of health and we address it. But in modeling, we encounter problems of the sort that this slide shows, and it's a very well known one in the physical sciences, and in particular, the big challenge for weather and climate prediction. That is the role of uncertainty in the models. All models have uncertainty in them. There's a lot of parameters we don't know exactly. And in a biological human model, the parameters will be patient-specific, and there are aspects of the dynamics that are also uncertain. In particular, there's this concept that we've known about for at least 30 years or so. I wrote a previous book on that. In fact, The Hour of Time I wrote in Frontiers of Complexity dwell heavily on this. That is that unless you were to know the initial conditions for a simulation with absolute precision, you have uncertainty perpetuating. So we're making probabilistic predictions, and that's what we will be doing in the medical case as well. We can't know with absolute certainty what tomorrow's weather is like, but we can talk about what the probabilities are of it happening. And that leads to actionable predictions in weather forecasts. When I'm in London, I hear a prediction that tomorrow it's going to rain. I get my umbrella ready and I take it out. You see where this is going to go with the biomedical case, which is much more, a matter of life and death in some cases. So this is the situation you get for predictions of weather forecasts. They tend to work very well for the next 3 or 4 days, and then they become increasingly less accurate over time, over a few more days, but they can be rectified and improved by continually taking into account new data from observations at the current time, rather than relying on the stuff that you had to make the predictions at the beginning of the week in this case. And this video, and I hope you can see it, is an example of Tropical Storm Ian that was simulated ahead of the impact of that hurricane in mainland USA, where it would impact the coastline in, I should say, southeast of the USA, and the impact that it would have at its strongest point in terms of damage. And as a result of these sorts of predictions, actions were taken that are known to have saved several hundred lives. So it shows the power of prediction, even of events which are as complicated as these, if you can run the simulations with sufficient fidelity. That's again the message I'm trying to convey here. So now at last I turn to the human body and I ask the question of how realistic is it for us to do these things? And it's easy to try and claim it's not going to work. But the point about the physical sciences, modeling and simulation, using techniques from computer science, for sure, AI, machine learning, is that no matter the complexity of the systems, it's possible to make predictions that have quantitative value. We don't always have all the information, but we can quantify the uncertainty in the predictions such that we know within limits how reliable they're going to be. This is all part and parcel of the state of science in the modern period. So just to talk a little bit briefly about us and the virtual human, I've been talking about this for quite a while with various people in the public eye as well as scientifically. It's just an example of a picture from a big meeting that we ran at the Science Museum in London back in 2017. In fact, when that film I just showed you, the beginning was premiered, and I'm on the second from the right, and the guy in the center is Roger Highfield, who's my co-author here. The others are colleagues of mine who work in the areas I'm discussing today. So how do you build digital twins from multi-scale data? You need a lot of data, and it comes at all types of length and timescales. So make no mistake, I'm not trying to claim we would build a virtual human that's reliable purely out of the genome level. I know there are some people who might try and claim, give me your genome in its entirety and I will predict your life course from birth to death. Along the way, all the things that were incurred as a result of disease and so on. But frankly, that's not taken seriously because, there are many things in human biology that are controlled, like the genome expression is controlled by events at much higher levels in the human body and also by the environment. And as soon as I talk about the environment, you're thinking about climate change and other things. That has nothing to do with what was written down in the genome at the beginning. So it's far more complicated, and we need all this other information on phenotypical data as well. And then there's the role of things like artificial intelligence. So if we do stay down at the molecular level for a moment here, some of the things we're interested in doing is are to predict, let's say, drugs that will work properly, effectively for individuals. You'll be aware probably that in the pharma industry, we don't have a very convincing picture. It takes on average 10 years to produce a drug. It costs $3 billion. When it works, and when it works at best, it seldom works for more than 50% of the population, because there are all these effects that are person-specific, particularly the genome in this case, that are not being considered. Now, if you have a method like AlphaFold from DeepMind, which is now part of Google. This is very interesting because it purports to take the primary sequence of the proteins, which are sort of programmed by the DNA sequence, and it will predict their three-dimensional structures. Why do we need the 3D structures? Well, if we're doing drug design, we absolutely must know that information. And historically, it takes a long time to acquire it. But if we can just write down the sequence of the protein that we've sequenced, let's say it's for targets from COVID or some other new disease, then we can predict the 3D structures very quickly. And we're away beginning to do drug discovery. And we can potentially do it on a person-specific level as well. And that's one of the things we're interested in. So AI is always going to have something very important to say here, but it does have limitations. I will come a bit back to those. But at the moment, I want to just emphasize this interaction with supercomputers that was mentioned at the beginning and in the video, because what we're trying to do here is to understand mechanistically what's happening with individual patients, not just doing this statistical inference. I've seen a bunch of previous patients, therefore I've got a machine learning model and I can tell what's going to happen to you. That does require a lot of computing to train the models, but once it's in place, you would think it's instantaneous. I hinted at why that may not be reliable and can come back to that later. So if we do the mechanistic modeling here, we absolutely must use supercomputers. And today's supercomputers are very powerful ones. We've just sort of breached the exascale, which is 10 to the 18 floating point numbers per second. And certainly we have an official exascale computer that I use at Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee. It's a Department of Energy supercomputer called Frontier, but there are some interesting Chinese machines that are particularly relevant to this talk in this country, which are at or around the exascale already. And I mentioned exascale. At that scale, you can begin to do really interesting large-scale simulations of many organ systems. Large parts of the drug discovery platform can be included on these machines. And the purpose of this is to do or exploit IT to do predictive studies prior to doing experiments, and only start doing the experiments once you've sorted out the best candidates, let's say for a drug discovery problem or for a problem in another area of healthcare. And I have emphasis on what we call VVUQ, which is validation, verification, and uncertainty quantification. I've already used the words uncertainty quantification in this talk 3 or 4 times. And the importance is make your predictions actionable, trustworthy, convincing, so that in this case, the medics and the clinicians realize that they had better take notice of what the predictions are, rather than saying, I'd rather wait to see what the outcome is. And as we get to more and more powerful machines, this becomes increasingly feasible. So what we do today in this area, things like virtual drug testing, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, we've done a number of studies here that have an impact on how you can treat individual patients by looking at their genome sequences. Maybe there are mutations in infectious diseases that are different for different patients, and they will respond differently to different drugs. But you can do the studies that are required to determine how strong the candidate compounds will be with those patients' target proteins in the computer prior to actually administering. And so you can build up a large workflow around drug development and personalized medicine on these big machines that can cover a lot of different candidates, patient-specific protein sequences concurrently on the machines. Because this talk is general, I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but it's an example, in fact, for us of where we combine 2 methodologies that I've also touched on. Some of it is AI and machine learning, where the calculations, once you've done training, can be exceptionally fast, but they're not typically accurate enough. They can rank a set of compounds without doing very severe compute on them. And then with that ranked set of compounds, you can do more we call fine-grained physics-based studies to work out exactly what the ordering of the compounds is. And that can be an iterative loop. And on a supercomputer like Frontier, which is vast, you can run these calculations concurrently and huge numbers of them. So just for a moment, thinking ahead of where this is taking us, I mentioned at the beginning, what does it offer? If you recall, I was talking about population medicine. I talked about trying drugs out on different people. And then there's the animal testing, which clearly is going to be diminished. And it's already being shown by some of the work we're involved in that using human data and simulations in silico clinical trials is more effective at determining which drugs will work than using animal experiments, which are today we human patient data, which is very gratifying. And then how we can treat people at risk and improve their experiences. So briefly, because we're going to run out of time if I go into all of these things in detail, I just spoke about the molecular end of this, particularly in drug discovery and personalized medicine in the sense of treating patients with different compounds and drugs. But of course, what's challenging in biology is this hierarchy of structures. And this picture is just showing some interesting representations of the most sophisticated cell models that exist today, where we've got 3D representations of all the glorious things going on inside a cell, and the representation of how the genome is to some extent controlling the evolution and the replication of those cells. One of the leading people in this area is somebody called Marcus Covert, who's at Stanford University, who we work with quite a bit in writing this chapter. And he's been able to do some really interesting studies that have made predictions of things in certain sets of bacterial cells that have been shown to be the case after the predictions have been made. But I'm not going to dwell on anything more because of the lack of time until you get to the level of the organ systems, because those ones are ultimately, from a conceptual point of view, the things where we look at a human in its entirety or some visually appealing scale and say, well, we're really dealing with some human here. And I just show this example because Yoon Sun is a Korean woman who died relatively young and whose body was donated to an anatomical library at a company called It's a not-for-profit organization spun out of ETH in Zurich. They have anatomical libraries. They have all the data on her organ systems and some of the things we're interested in there, like heart and the vasculature from head to toe. And I just want to mention examples here because some of the work I do myself in this area is building computational models that are patient-specific that treat the entirety of the vasculature from head to toe of a human, arteries and veins, and the coupling of them between capillary beds and networks that can run on very big supercomputers. So we're now able to run whole human blood flow simulations on the Frontier machine. No machine that we've had access to before that is capable of doing those simulations. And that takes a lot of effort. You have to develop a code that's, as we say, scalable, because there are of the order of 10,000 nodes on Frontier, and let's say maybe 500,000 to 1 million cores. But more particularly, there are, by some counting, 8 GPUs per node there. So you could say this machine has of the order of 80,000 GPUs on it. So to be able to harness all of those to a single calculation is what I'm talking about here, and to run it scalably is the challenge. But we now are able to do that. And I'm talking about organ systems. This is an example of the human heart. In some cases, the heart being the most advanced in terms of modeling and simulation, has software that's being prepared and used by commercial companies to support studies by medics with very kind of easy to use interfaces. It's just snapshots from software from, I think this is ANSYS in the US, but Dassault Systèmes, a French company, also offers these things now. And you may have seen a simulation earlier that we ran for the respiratory system, figuring out what's going to happen to aerosols when they're sprayed into the nose. This is very relevant to COVID infectious disease as well. What happens when you inhale aerosols, where the particles end up going. Another thing that we talked about, you'll remember, I hope, was the study of the neuromuscular skeletal system and our ability to predict fractures in advance of their occurrence by using modeling and simulation and imaging that's patient specific. And so you can ward off fractures and cause people, you save people a lot of problems by predictively advising how they can evade those types of difficulties. This talk is not supposed to dwell heavily on the brain. Suspect sometimes in these presentations people want to discuss the brain, and I'm happy to do that. Here I'm just talking about networks. We do model blood flow in the brain. I mentioned that earlier, to a very high level of precision now, but this one is just an example of what happens with people who suffer epileptic fits, and some of the drugs that people try to use and administer there need to be targeted to the right parts of the brain. So the pathways that are relevant here are now enumerated, and there's a large sort of clinical trial that's based on modeling and simulation of the effects of the interactions within the brain here in a French ongoing clinical study that appears to be having benefits to the health and well-being of those who don't respond to standard drug treatments. So just by way of illustrating what goes on when you go beyond single organ systems, because in the long run, the virtual human will be based on joining components together, organ systems, which are roughly speaking the same physico-chemical length and timescales, like heart, vasculature, lungs, all these sort of things. We need to couple them together. There's the multi-scale aspect from molecule upward that also has to be paid attention to. But this is just an example of what we do today in coupling the heart models that colleagues of mine at Barcelona Supercomputing Center have developed. It's called ALIA, mentioned at the top left here, and the code I've developed called HEMEL-B with my team. So I was talking about the vasculature and our ability to model blood flow in the arteries and the veins. But what happens if we have a very high fidelity model of the heart, which has electrophysiology, the mechanical beating of the heart, but not only just those things, the fluid dynamics of blood flow in and out. That's what ALIA provides, and it's arguably one of the most sophisticated and powerful and patient-specific heart models that exist. Suppose we couple that to HEMEL-B. Well, the news here is that since this book was written largely, we're now doing precisely that, so that we can have a closed system, which is a cardiovascular one, the heart pumping blood around the arteries and veins. And immediately when you do that, you're at a scale that's largely unconsidered in medicine and certainly scientifically, because it's becoming like a global entire human scale, where we can ask questions about the influence of treatment in one area and the impact on other organ systems and diseases. So rather than looking at disease cases as totally separate, we start realizing that they're not. There are always interactions between them, and it's better for us to understand those than to continue to just treat things in isolation. This is the way we're going to be able to do it. And in the long run, it's the connection of all of these things up to increasingly high scales that we're concerned with, from, as it were, molecule to whole human. Though I would like to emphasize that we will never be trying to build from the bottom up here. I mentioned that earlier. We want to build at different levels to address different medical conditions and eventually stitch the things together with equal weight being given to each level. So just because this is interesting science and technology, well, maybe before I go into the science and technology, just mentioning here something I also touched on earlier, that my colleagues at Barcelona Supercomputing Center and also in Oxford now are doing studies which are virtual patient scale. So hundreds of patients, thousands being run on these large supercomputers. Each patient's heart, in these cases, is represented by the different parameters that the persons have. And so you're able to run virtual trials. You can test the effect of given drugs on the heart. So this is for an example of a toxicology study, which is important in the drug development cycle, which is again virtualized and can be done in silico rather than inflicted on real patients. So it's part of accelerating the drug discovery process. That's using models at the scale of the heart. So this is all starting to happen. This is just to whet your appetite. If you're interested in quantum computing, and I know there are people on my visit here in China who do quantum computing in a major way, and also where I am in the US and UK. Why is quantum computing interesting? Possibly one of the messages I've conveyed so far is we can't have enough computing power to solve these problems. We will always benefit from more. And the promise and potential of quantum computing is that it can solve some problems that conventional computers, the conventional digital ones that I was talking about so far, even the exascale machines cannot solve fast enough. And that's because quantum computers have an interesting form of parallelism that speeds up calculations in a way you cannot have accelerated on conventional computers. This is just an example of such a machine called Sycamore in Google back in the US. And I think I will just sort of show another example of this, because this is Ju Zhang from Professor Pen Zhang's lab in the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing here. I'm visiting in a couple of days as well. His is an optical quantum computer that's been shown to solve some problems that are sort of intractable for conventional computers. They published a paper in Science 2 or so years ago. It may be difficult for you to discern the scale here, but that's roughly the size of what we call a billiard table. And I'm interested in working with them in case my problems that I'm interested in could be put on such a machine. And the things that we might be able to do there are actually accelerate aspects of the drug discovery pipeline that I mentioned even more than we do today. So that's part of the message here. There's one other amusing thing. This is the Greek Antikythera mechanism. Just to remind everyone that the Greeks themselves and others, no doubt the Chinese thousands of years ago, knew how to use analog computers. And analog computers are things that we turned away from with the development of the digital computer during and just after World War II, because it's easier to program digital computers. But I'm not, and I won't discuss now because there isn't really time here to dwell on the details of this. But we've shown in some of our work that floating point numbers, particularly for chaotic systems, floating point numbers are not always reliable in predicting behavior, whereas analog systems are. And analog machines are ones that can handle the continuum numbers in mathematics, whereas digital computers by definition cannot. And I just want to remind everyone that whereas, let's say, the frontier system requires 30 megawatts of energy to power itself, the human brain needs only 20 kilowatts or so to do it. So there's a huge disparity in the energy requirement there, which is, I should say 20 watts here, which is something very desirable, again, in the context of things like climate change and the amount of power and energy that's being dissipated in these large machines. We want systems that are more environmentally friendly in the future. So that's one word. And I think with that, I can stop. This is a slide that indicates a number of people who've worked with me. It's by no means reasonably representative. It's just some in recent past and a number of agencies that have funded my work. But I would like to stop there. And if I might bail out of this, I'd like to then run the last second movie, and then we can open up a discussion. Would that work with you? Great. So let me just do that. I have to now find where that is. Is it down here? This one.
You have to
open it. Yeah.
Have to change what you share.
Yeah. Yeah, I can share this. So briefly, this film is called The Next Pandemic, and it looks at what happened with the COVID pandemic and how computers started to be used to try and handle problems with it, and indicates what might happen with the next one that comes along. So let's see if I can get this running, and we make sure we don't lose the sound on the way. Let me know if you can hear it and see it.
Over the past decades, viruses spread by animals have caused severe diseases in people. That was the story of SARS, MERS, and now COVID-19. As the global population surges in coming decades to almost 10 billion people, changes in land use will prime the planet for future spillovers of infections. The question is not if there will be future pandemics, but when. And most importantly, will we be ready? We just might. There is a new weapon in the fight against global diseases, the supercomputer. During the global COVID-19 pandemic, we used them to simulate almost everything, from the microscopic world of the virus to the many possible ways to treat the infection, understand how the virus spreads, or predict the future course of the pandemic. Using supercomputers, we can look at the spread of the virus as it travels through the air from one person to another, and study the effectiveness of masks, air conditioning, and social distancing. Or move down to the microscopic level and simulate the virus in amazing detail to understand how it pirates our cells to reproduce. This coronavirus uses spikes to latch on to human cells, coating them with compounds called glycan chains to make them invisible to our immune system. Computer simulations have revealed chinks in this armor, small regions free of glycans that are vulnerable to human antibodies. Enzymes like this one help coronaviruses infect our cells. Scientists can simulate in a matter of hours how this and other targets respond to hundreds of drug candidates to find new antiviral drugs, which may work for new variants, even novel human coronaviruses. But a promising treatment can sometimes come at a high cost. Because viruses borrow our biochemistry to multiply, they are hard to combat without also damaging infected cells. The drugs employed to treat the disease can occasionally cause life-threatening side effects, such as disturbances to the rhythm of the heart. Luckily for us, simulations of human cells, tissues, and organs are becoming ever more sophisticated, allowing doctors to explore the effects of an infection on the entire body. We are entering the era of exascale computers, machines 1,000 times faster than the previous generation. More powerful machines combined with new knowledge, artificial intelligence, and smarter software will help us understand and fight these silent enemies. When the next pandemic comes along, and it will, the virtual human will be ready to simulate the virus and its effects, and devise solutions to the pandemic at pandemic speed.
There we go, I've done.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Coveney, and for such a fascinating talk and with a lot of cutting edge information. And also the video is really promising. Thank you.